Let's get going. Welcome everyone to the latest edition of the Just Ask ASHE webinar series. My name is Wes, and I'm a senior education specialist at ASHE here to help out today. Before we get started, I'd like to make a few announcements. Firstly, the information presented during this webinar is provided by ASHE as a service to its members. This information may not apply to every viewer's specific situation and is not a substitute for application of the viewer's own independent judgment or the advice of a competent professional. Furthermore, ASHE does not make any guarantee or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of any information provided today. ASHE and the panelists disclaim liability for personal injury, property damage, or other damages of any kind, whether special, indirect, inconsequential, or compensatory, that may result directly or indirectly from use of or reliance on information from this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in your learning center by the end of the week. ASHE will also have the on-demand webinar available on the ASHE website shortly thereafter. We ask that you please remain muted to eliminate any background noise that could interfere with the webinar. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat box at any time. We'll have plenty of time to answer questions, hopefully, at the end of the presentation. As a friendly reminder, please complete the evaluation in your learning center at learning.asha.org in order to receive your CEC. When you log back into the Learning Center, you'll see the Launch Evaluation tab next to the webinar name. Once you complete and submit the evaluation, your certificate will be available in the Completed tab. I'll share a link near the end of this webinar with detailed information about how to access your Learning Center in case you need assistance. And finally, if you have any questions for ASHE, please feel free to reach out to the ASHE staff at asheeeducation@asha.org, and I'll share that info in the chat as well. At this time, I'm pleased to turn it over to our moderator today, Jonathan Flannery, the Senior Associate Director of Advocacy at ASHE, who will be directing this webinar. Jonathan, whenever you're ready, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Appreciate that, especially going over those disclaimers. Today we have three subject matter experts available to us. First, we have Mr. Tim Adams. Tim is the senior consultant for MSL. Tim joined the MSL in 2022, serving as a senior consultant, and Tim has nearly 40 years of experience in healthcare that spans the areas of facilities management, design and construction, clinical engineering, compliance, life safety, and codes and standards advocacy. Prior to joining MSL, the MSL team, Tim served as a System Director of Environment of Care and Life Safety at the Indiana University Health and as the Director of Leadership Development for the American Society for Healthcare Engineering. And he was involved in the areas of education, code, and standard compliance and advocacy. Welcome, Tim.
It is good to be here.
Our next SME is Mr. Mark Chrisman. Mark joined Henderson Engineers in 2004 and quickly began establishing client relationships that he still maintains today. As a principal and the healthcare sector executive, Mark coordinates strategies to support Henderson's healthcare sector clients and partners across North America. He has designed healthcare environments for some of the biggest names in the industry. Mark is heavily involved with many professional organizations, including ASHE, NFPA, and the ICC, among others. And he was recognized as the Outstanding Building Professional on Healthcare Design's 2020 HCD 10. Welcome, Mark.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Our final subject matter expert is Mr. William Koffel. Bill Koffel is president and founder of Koffel Associates Incorporated. He is recognized as an expert in the fire protection and life safety aspects of codes and standards. Bill graduated in 1979 with a Bachelor of Science in Fire Protection Engineering from the University of Maryland. He earned his professional engineering license in the specialty of fire protection engineering in 1983 and worked in private industry as well as in the Maryland State Fire Marshal's office. Totally committed to the fire protection and life safety industry with its governing code standards and design guides, Bill is past president of the Society of Fire Protection Engineers, serves on numerous NFPA technical committees, is a past member of the Department of Veterans Affairs Advisory Committee on Structural Safety Issues, and is one of a handful of approved NFPA instructors teaching various code-related seminars nationally and internationally. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just to add to the disclaimers that Wes had earlier, as a member of several NFPA and ICC committees, anything I say could be considered my interpretation, my opinion, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any of those committees.
Thanks, Bill. And we should make sure that everyone's aware that all of us, as we speak on this, are representing our own opinions, and that if you want an official interpretation from one of the co-development organizations, you need to reach out to them and request a formal interpretation. Well, let's get to our questions. First and foremost, I would like to revisit a question that we had in our first quarter, 2023 Just Ask ASHE webinar. We had this question then, and unfortunately had been waiting for an interpretation from the Healthcare Interpretation Task Force within the NFPA. That interpretation had not been finalized and didn't come out until after our Just Ask ASHE webinar. So we need to revisit this question. The question is, if I have an ice machine in a patient care area and do not have GFCI installed, do I need to install a GFCI? And at that time, with the interpretation that was going on, the answer was actually yes. We know now, after this was reviewed by the HITF, I should explain that the HITF is a task force of all of the accrediting organizations and for healthcare facilities, and they meet together at the NFPA conference and go over some of these particular interpretations. And they were asked if you had to have a GFCI on an ice machine, and their response was no, with the clarification, unless otherwise required by Article 210.8 of the NFPA 70. So there are some requirements there. You do need to look at Article 210.8, but the vast majority of ice machines are set up in a way that they don't meet those or they're set up in a way that do not require a GFCI outlet. Another one was they also reviewed a question in regards to whether a non-required fire door had to be inspected and tested. So for example, if there's a rated door and a non-rated barrier, does that need to be inspected and tested? The HITF determined that this is not required. Specifically, they said that since it's not in a rated barrier, it's not required. Now, one of the key caveats here you got to be aware of is they're going to go off of your life safety plan. So if your life safety plans are inaccurate, that could cause you problems. So make sure to keep your life safety plans up to date. So you do not have to do the inspection and testing of those doors that are not in a rated barrier. The last one I want to cover is spare breakers. This has been a really hot topic. We know that there's been several citations and issues in regards to this issue. Does NFPA 70 and subsequent editions of 2011 and subsequent editions require properly labeled spare breakers to be kept in any specific position, either on or off? The interpretation of that was no, it doesn't. NFPA 70 does not require them to be in a specific position. One thing you need to be aware of on this is if you as a facility have a specific policy that states what they will be, and you need to follow your policy. But other than that, there's not a specific position they're required to be in. All of this information and further information, some of them can be found at that web link that I have on all three of these slides. That is where the minutes can be found of that meeting that covered those specific questions. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to our next current question for Just Ask ASHE in regards to smoke barrier door latching. The question that was submitted was, we rendered the bottom latch on a smoke barrier door as inoperable. A recent survey cited this as a finding. I thought that smoke barrier doors did not require a latch. Why were we cited for the latch being inoperable? Bill, would you be willing to address this one for us?
Sure, Jonathan. And my answer to this question has changed over the past week. We had a facility that experienced this issue, and the finding was removed from their report. So my answer would have been at that time that because it's not required for new construction, I can reduce an existing fire safety feature, life safety feature, if it's not required for new construction. However, there's a caveat to that it doesn't create a false sense of security. So from my perspective, if the door is not required to have a latch, we could remove this hardware. We reached out to an accrediting organization to try to get something in writing. And we had a discussion with them, and we came to, I thought, an understanding during the meeting that as long as one latch worked, they were okay with that, even though a latch is not required. And the problem is a lot of these older doors had bottom and top latches, and they wanted to disable the bottom latch. So that would have been my answer at that point in time. Well, last week I received in writing the response from the accrediting organization, and they have said, no, the hardware has to be maintained or it has to be removed. You can remove it, but that would be a cost. You have to remove it because the presence of that hardware would create a false sense of security. My thought was if at least one latch worked, we were probably okay. So Jonathan mentioned HITF. Given that interpretation, this is something that we are going to take to HITF in their meeting in June. Remember, and this kind of gets to a comment in the chat box, Jonathan, the participating organizations, CMS, the state agencies, and the accrediting organizations, they're not bound to follow the guidance from HITF. So I'm hoping to get a response from HITF that would say, yes, you can remove the latch because it's not required for new. There could still be some operating inoperable hardware on the door, that it's not going to create a false sense of security, very similar to your fire door question that you talked about. But short answer is, based upon what I have in writing, you need to maintain any latching hardware on a smoke barrier door, or you need to remove that hardware so as not to create a false sense of security.
Thank you, Bill. Great response, and hopefully we'll be coming back and revisiting this later on after the HITF visits that. But the specific question that came up in the chat, and I appreciate you pointing that out, is how do we get our state on board with these 3 items to reduce findings? Our recommendation, ASHE's recommendation for you on that, is that you go to that website. Let me back up one slide for you. You go to this website here down in the bottom of the slide. You pull down those minutes, print those out, highlight the ones you're specifically want to address during the survey, and have that ready during the survey. That way you can have that discussion with those with your surveyor right then and there. Again, as Bill stated, there is no requirement that they follow these interpretations. These are interpretations from the Healthcare Interpretations Task Force, which is in a formal task force of the NFPA. So ideally they will, but there's no guarantee they will. But having that documentation and showing that you're on top of that and that you're aware of all of that. Thanks for putting that link right in the chat there, Wes. Appreciate that. We'll show that you're on top of it and know why you're doing what you're doing. So that's very important. All right. Were there any other comments or thoughts on the smoke barrier door latching? If not, we'll jump on to our next question, which is in regards to lithium batteries. Does anybody have restrictions on where electric bikes and the like may be stored or parked, or have a policy specific to the use of lithium batteries? Mark, can you talk to this one for us a little bit?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, this is as everybody's probably seen, maybe not overnight, but there was just quite an eruption of e-bikes, e-scooters kind of all over the place. And I think that the short answer is there's no current codes or standards that address them, at a national level. From what we have found, there are some municipalities, New York City being one of them, that are looking at building out their guidance on where you could store them, where you could charge them. Looking a little bit deeper from that, getting into NFPA 70 and potentially even NFPA 855, there's some guidance in there how to make this a safer process, and how you can get through that a little bit better. And then, in terms of the storage, there's no address, or there's nothing addressing the actual storage as it's related to e-bikes right now. Now, I would say that those folks in the industry are aware that there is concerns here, and that internally we're trying to figure out how to do that. And within, each, design firm, architects, engineers, construction companies, we're looking at how we can make that safer. I think most importantly, NFPA Fire Protection Research Foundation is actually looking into this right now. And I think they're in the early stages of a study to try to help us figure out what does this mean, and how can we address it a little bit better. So, stay tuned on this topic, and then definitely welcome any other thoughts that Tim or Bill potentially have heard through their sources.
I can just jump in real quick on this, Mark. I know that this is a very, very hot topic in the ICC world. We addressed some of these issues in the fire code in the last, the 2024 edition. But again, they're getting more and more specific, and they really don't address what this one specifically is talking about, is electric bikes and those kind of things. Any other thoughts or comments on this? All right, hearing none, we'll jump to our next question. Eyewash requirements. Had someone submit a question: is an eyewash station with water access required in a laundry area, or can an alternate type of eyewash be provided? Tim, will you talk to us about this one?
I would be glad to. The eyewash is like kind of the gift that keeps on giving. It just, it seems like we're constantly dealing with questions and problems related to eyewash and testing and such. And I'm from Indiana, so I say wash, but it's really eyewash, okay? But the challenge is, first we need to start with, is an eyewash required, period? And then we can go to what types are allowed. So we'll sort of start there. There are some references that are used. OSHA reference that is shown on your screen, and there is an ANSI standard for emergency eyewash and shower standard. OSHA doesn't directly in writing reference this ANSI standard, but it is quite often used or given folks when they are working through issues with OSHA. And some states have some guidance on their OSHA sites also that's maybe similar or slightly different. But in general, the location where an eyewash is required comes down to what chemicals can a person come into contact with in that area that they might be using, or the chemical would be outside the bottle or the container. And it's based on pH. If there was a pH less than 2.5 or greater than 11.5, so it's either an acid or a caustic, and we base whether we need an eyewash on that. There's some other requirements then. If you need to have an eyewash, it has to be, or is supposed to be, no more than 10 seconds to reach. And if you want to go ahead and flip to the next slide. The location needs to be at the same level as the hazard, and the path to get to the eyewash free of obstructions. And the location is identified easily with signage, so it's easy to find. The eyewash itself needs to produce fluid at the correct spray pattern for 15 minutes, which is about 0.4 gallons per minute, or 1.5 liters. The challenge here with using some type of portable eyewash, I see folks where they really should have an eyewash based on the chemicals that are being used, and they have these little squeeze bottles with an eye cup on them. That can't give you 0.4 gallons for 15 minutes. So this helps us determine what type of an eye wash we're going to have. The water needs to be tepid between 60 and 100 degrees, and it needs a single action to operate, so that once you activate the eye wash, the hands are not required to sustain the operation. All that being said, we start with, do we need an eye wash based on what chemicals are in the area and that a person's eyes might come into contact with? If we determine that we need an eye wash, it needs to meet these other requirements. So we can use a plumbed eye wash that has a water source with tepid water, 60 to 100 degrees, as we said. There are portable eye washes, if you will, that can be mounted, that have tanks on them that can provide that proper flow of eye wash for a long enough period of time, for 15 minutes. Those are not small, they're large. They take some room to mount. So I guess the answer to your question, if you have already determined that you need an eye wash in the laundry area, there is an alternate type, but it is not a little squeeze bottle. It has to be something that is able to meet all of these requirements, including the 15-minute flow. Wherever we have an eye wash, period. If we have an eye wash, whether we are using chemicals in the area where we need one, if the eye wash is there, it must be inspected weekly. If it's a plumbed eye wash, it must flow water. Must check to be sure there's not debris under the caps, that the caps pop open on it, that when you're done, you put the caps back on. If it is a tank type of eye wash, we don't flow that, because obviously every time you test, you would be depleting that fluid, but it does need to have a weekly inspection. And those tanks of water, or tanks of fluid for the eye wash, have an expiration date on them. So every so often, those tanks have to be changed out. So I know the answer sounds a little like it depends, but first look at do you have chemicals in the area? Do you need an eye wash? And then if you do, be sure your eye wash meets all of these requirements.
Thanks, Tim. That's probably our favorite answer on Just Ask ASHE. It depends. No. Mark or Bill, any thoughts or comments on eye wash? I guess I should include Wes on there too, because Wes is still on. So, all right, not hearing any, we'll move on to our next question. And that's in regards to duct cleaning. Had a friend of mine submit a question. I'm doing a statement of work for duct cleaning services for OR rooms and SPD. Can anyone share their quality assurance surveillance plan? Mark, can you talk to kind of what the requirements are on this?
Yeah, certainly. So, obviously each facility and location and, policy on this is kind of, tailored for that specific location. But I think what we're kind of trying to highlight here is locations for where you can look forward for the specific requirements. One of them being ASHRAE 170. There's a section 10.6 there, kind of goes into duct cleanliness for specific locations like the operating rooms, delivery rooms, trauma rooms, and some other locations. So a little bit of information there. Also, those that have not checked out the ASHRAE's HVAC design manual for hospital and clinics, some good information there on kind of best practices for what could go on in that realm. And then amazingly, if you have any access to, local university or, a way to get into research publications, there's actually numerous papers from nationally listed, researchers that have been peer reviewed on, again, some best practices here, and then how they actually went about it, testing it, durations, frequency, those types of things. And then lastly, I think hopefully everybody on this call is familiar with My ASHE. That is a great, resource for things like this. Often posting in the chat board will allow, get some other folks that may be willing to actually share their plan, maybe redact their name and kind of share best practices. So My ASHE, again, is a great resource for something like this, and would highly recommend you check that out for specifics.
Thanks, Mark. Actually, I pulled this one off of My ASHE. So when I saw that Hosky had posted this, I jumped on it and pulled it in, because I thought this was a great one to have us dig a little deeper into it. And Mark is right on. There are some a little bit of reference under section 10.6 and ASHE standard 170, but there's really not a lot out there. So, encourage folks to look into this. This became a pretty hot topic during COVID, of course, because we're looking at a lot of ventilation and stuff. So that's why a lot of that research is happening right now. So Tim or Bill, or Wes, any thoughts on this?
Nope.
None
I
for
don't
me.
think anything additional on my end.
All right. Appreciate that. Thanks, guys. All right, let's move on to our next question then. And this is in boiler oversight. Do we have to have a boiler licensed employee on site if we use boilers to heat small rural hospitals? Tim, you want to talk to this one?
Sure, this is a short answer. It depends. But it comes down to state and local requirements. I would like to say probably not. Depending on what the boiler is, if it's a hot water boiler and you're, what kind of jurisdiction you're in. But it really depends on state and local requirements. There are certain states that require a boiler licensed employee on site. And often that is based on, is it hot water or steam boiler? What is the pressure and the temperature operating at? What is the steam pressure if it's a steam boiler? And perhaps what is the boiler horsepower? Or some states or local entities might use square inches of heating surface of the boiler instead of the boiler horsepower as a differentiator. So you really have to look at where the facility is located to see what the requirements are for that, because it does vary from locale to locale.
Thanks, Tim. Any other thoughts, Mark or Bill or Wes?
None.
I would like to also mention that I actually was able to get a reduction in my insurance premium by assuring them that we had licensed boiler operators on site. That had never been done before I got to the facility. So I pulled in the insurance folks and said, hey, and it was actually a fairly significant decrease in the premium. Because if you can't guarantee that, they look at that as a big risk. So having that sometimes will help. Since our state already required it, all we had to do is provide that in writing to them and show the certifications and stuff, and that helped reduce that. So,
Jonathan, we have a question in the chat about power strips in non-patient care areas, and do they need to be mounted?
okay,
Do we want to?
Thanks for
table that?
letting me. I'm not seeing that one.
You know what? It was sent as a direct message to me.
Oh, okay, cool, not a problem. Why don't we hold that one for later? Let's get through the ones we've got. Okay.
Copy that.
Thanks. All right, let's move on to our next slide, or our next question, I should say. Damper remote inspections. We are designing a new facility and wanted to use remote inspection fire and smoke dampers. We are being told that they are not permitted despite manufacturer's literature saying they are. Can we use remote inspection dampers? Bill, can you talk to us on this one?
Sure. I could probably use Tim's answer and just say it depends. I think what I'd like to say is I would hope you could, but if we actually look at the code trail, we're required to comply with the 2012 Additional Life Safety Code, which references the 2010 edition of NFPA 80, and that should be NFPA 80 in the slide, not NFPA 90. So references the 2010 edition of NFPA 80 and 105. They say nothing about remote inspection dampers. There has been language added in the 2019 edition of NFPA 80 and 105 that does specifically address remote inspection dampers. Now think about it from the healthcare facility. And I know the requirement is every 6 years, but imagine if you did not have to get above the ceiling, get access into that duct and visually put your eyes on that damper to verify its operation. How much more likely you would be to conduct those tests and maybe even do them more frequently than every 6 years. If it was simply a matter of let's operate the damper with position switch, let's verify that it closes completely, and let's verify that it opens back up. So in my mind, I would hope that you could, but in reality, We know the code trail doesn't really get us there. I could argue equivalencies, but we know we're not always successful with state agencies and accrediting organizations and CMS with equivalencies. So the conservative answer today is you can't use them yet. If we go to a newer edition of the Life Safety Code, you might be able to use them. I know of a facility that is designing the facility with anticipation that they can do it. So they're putting everything in, all the equipment's in. We're going to put remote inspection dampers in. We're putting the control modules in on the fire alarm system to get the signals if it doesn't pass the test. But they are still, if between now and 1 year you have to do an inspection, 1 year after acceptance, then you have to do 6 years thereafter, with the hope that maybe in year 7, we'll be under some newer edition of the standards and we no longer would have to physically observe the position of that damper. I will say 2 other things that relate it, however. This issue is currently being debated again within the 80 and 105 committee. The first draft would be, it's the intent, they didn't do it well, but the intent is to take out the reliance on remote inspection dampers to require some dampers, and they're using, I think right now the proposal is every 3 cycles. On a hospital, that would be every 18 years, you would have to put eyes on the damper. So there's still some benefit to it. That's first draft. Who knows what will happen? I'm sure there will be public comments submitted to overturn that. The other thing I would say, especially for those of you in larger jurisdictions, is that there have been some initiatives at the local level to mandate, by labor, to mandate visual inspections of those dampers. So again, I'm seeing that mostly in larger municipalities, but you would need to check with your local jurisdiction as well. So sorry, it's not an easier answer, but I'll go back to it depends, and I hope so.
Thanks, Bill. This is a very tricky one. One of the other things, if you determine you do want to move forward with it, I would highly suggest you coordinate that with your AHJ, whoever's approving your plans before you go there. So, because you want to make sure they're on board with that too. Tim or Mark or Wes, any thoughts?
No, nothing for me. It would be great if we can get to a point where at least some of those inspections can be remote.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to our next question, which is in regards to pharmaceutical warehouse requirements. What are some of the codes and standards to be included in the design brief or owner's project requirements for the design and construction of a pharmaceutical warehouse? Mark, can you talk to that one?
Yeah, so this is a very, very loose question. There's a lot that can happen within a pharmaceutical warehouse, and they're totally right. Getting into the owner project requirements and what specifically they're looking for. Guessing at this point, we're probably doing some sort of compounding potentially, but first place, we're always going to start local and state building codes, standards. That's a no-brainer there, and try to look up what's going on there. If you've got the storage requirements for non-sterile, non-hazardous drugs, it's going to be USP 795. It's going to be one we're going to get into, and then beyond that, drug manufacturers have specific requirements in terms of temperature, humidity ranges that oftentimes will exceed what's in the USP standards. Again, USP standards are kind of a best practice, but you've got to look beyond that, knowing that some other requirements could come in there. If we are looking at hazardous drugs that are going to be stored in the warehouse, and you're looking at USP 800, which I think everyone's kind of seen. There's been a lot of talk about USP 800, USP 797 over the last couple of years, for sure in that realm. And then if we do get into compounding, depending on if it is going to be physician assigned, 503A compounding or 503B, which would go more towards medical facilities, hospitals. One of those standards is going to apply and kind of help guide us with what we need to kind of talk through when you're going through an OPR. So regardless of that, these are very, very complex spaces, and that you need to have a lot of discussion around this, just because there's so many systems in play there. And just a lot of focus on temperature, humidity and pressure. So definitely lots to talk about there.
You bet. Thanks. Yeah, and a lot of it really depends, Mark, as you kind of mentioned already, is what you're actually doing inside of this thing. So, yeah. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's move on to our next question then. Fire stop special inspections. In a recent article in HFM magazine, special inspections for fire stop systems were discussed. Is that something that is now required for new construction? Bill, can you talk to this one for us?
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Generally speaking, it probably is. It depends upon the addition of the IBC that you're using. NFPA 101 does not require any type of special inspection of through penetration fire stop systems or fire resistant joint systems. But the IBC, I think starting in maybe 2018, there is a requirement for special inspections for people in certain types of occupancies, and it's based upon structural design. But most healthcare facilities are going to fall into that category 3 or category 4 building where special inspections would be required for any new construction. I guess personally, I would offer that this is probably a good practice regardless of whether it's required or not. Unfortunately, a lot of facility people are inheriting problems from the initial construction, and you're being left with trying to correct that. I recently did a special inspection of a rehab facility, a rehabilitation project, I should say. And I pulled, this is a destructive test. So unless I see it go in, I have to remove it to see if it's done properly. I removed 3, either fire stop systems or joint systems. Actually, I removed 4. 3 of the first 4 I removed failed. And I simply looked at the contractor and I said, "You want me to continue?" He said, "No. We're going to get all the contractors in, correct it, and we'll bring you back when it's corrected." So unfortunately, this is something that's not often done correctly, especially if we allow the individual trades to do their own work. So following up with some type of inspection activity, either when it's being installed or after it's installed, is probably the most prudent thing a facility could do.
Thanks, Bill. I totally agree that a lot of this, the fire stopping is just never, it's one of those very, very issues that's very hard to get right. So the only other thing I would say in regards to that is make sure you're staying on top of that from the get-go of any construction. It's just so important, and that you're training your staff well so that they're doing it properly to begin with also. So Tim or Mark or Wes, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just over the last few years have seen several either new construction, complete new construction, or major renovations where the fire stops got problems, just not done well, and either whoever was doing it wasn't being diligent or somebody wasn't, and obviously probably wasn't a special inspection of that. But just don't want to be turning over buildings like that to patient use. Kind of, I'm sort of forget the codes and standards. It's just not the right thing to do to put people in a space that could be dangerous. And so, yeah, it's definitely something we need to keep our eyes on.
Great. Appreciate that, Tim. Any other thoughts before we move on to our next question? All right, our next question is in regards to anti-ligature phone cords. Is there a standard or requirement that addresses the maximum length of anti-ligature phone cords? Tim, will you talk to this one for us?
Can I use the HITF standard answer?
Yes, please.
No. There is not a standard that I'm aware of. There are some companies that sell phones. They're probably used more in prison situations and things like that, but phones that have a very short, very stout cord on them, 12 to 14 inches long. But I'm not aware of a specific requirement. Use risk assessment and consider the ligature risk, but also consider use as a weapon. Ligature risk is not the only risk. If we have a phone, how easy is it to break that free and have something hard in hand that could become a weapon?
Great. Thanks, Tim. I'm going to jump to the next question before asking any additional thoughts because it's extremely related. Anti-ligature for emergency pull cords. What is the guidance regarding the length of the emergency pulls in bathrooms? Tim, up to you again.
Excuse me. I think the original question wasn't anti-ligature. It had to do with the distance of cords from the floor. So I will just, before we get to that, I'll address behavioral health. Again, we have to think very, very diligent risk assessment about pull cords or anything like that. So, because that definitely can be a ligature risk. In restrooms, in non-behavioral risk areas, there isn't, that I know of, a hard and fast rule or a standard that guides the length of it. We want them to be accessible to the person laying on the floor. And we also want it to not be where it's going to get mopped, when we're doing floor care. The Joint Commission Resources has an EC Tour checklist, and it suggests 6 inches above the floor. Again, that is not a code standard hard and fast document. It's just a tool, a checklist that's out there, but enough that a person on the floor could reach over and have a chance to get a hold of it, but it's high enough off the floor it doesn't get gooey on the end from mopping and such taking place.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Mark, Bill, or Wes, any other thoughts on any of these? And you are correct, Tim, that's a typo on my part. That anti-ligature shouldn't have been there.
That's all right. We'll answer
but thanks
both
for
questions.
addressing that. Yeah. Mark or Bill, any thoughts? All right, not hearing any. The next question has got to be one of the most unusual questions I've gotten in Just Ask ASHE, so I really appreciate this one. Padded room fire rating. Do you have any experience with a 1-hour rating being required for padded rooms within healthcare facilities? I have not. Bill, can you talk to us about this?
Yes. So let's first remember that if I'm putting padding on the wall, that's an interior finish material, and I have to meet interior finish requirements. And for a foam plastic, which is what I'm likely to have in the padding, that has to be tested to a different standard than our typical interior finish materials. I need to test it to a room corner test. Now, the International Building Code has a table in it in Chapter 5. It's called incidental use. It's similar to what we generally refer to as hazardous areas in the Life Safety Code. And it does require rooms with padded walls to have a 1-hour fire resistance rating. That applies to Group I2, which is healthcare, and Group I3, which is detention and correctional occupancies. Within the Life Safety Code, I can only find that requirement in detention and correctional occupancies. However, I could see where an AHJ could determine that by putting the padding on the walls, that is now a hazardous area. Remember, hazardous area is a fuel package that is different than what I would normally expect in the healthcare clinical environment. I would not expect all that foam plastic on the wall. If an AHJ were to make that determination, then as a hazardous area, the 1 hour for new construction, 1 hour separation could be required. I don't think you can get there for existing if it's already sprinkled, because existing doesn't really define a severe hazardous area for healthcare. It generally gives me the option of sprinklers or separation. But the key here is, if you're building it new, the International Building Code applies, you would have to have a 1 hour separation around that room.
Thanks, Bill. All right. Any other thoughts on padded rooms? Besides the fact I might need one soon, but. All right. Well, you haven't been around my grandkids, okay, Bill? No, anyway. All right. Let's, without any other comments, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question, which is in regards to confined space. Can someone share their policies and procedures for confined spaces such as chiller rooms? I'm particularly interested in knowing what emergency procedures and equipment, O2 sensors, emergency escape brake, breathing device, etc., do we need to have in place? The chiller room uses refrigerant. Mark, can you talk to this one for us?
Yeah. So this is another great. It's going to depend a little bit on what type of refrigerant is being used, the quantity, volume of the space. So this is definitely a detailed discussion that probably needs to happen, on a granular level at each facility. That being said, there's definitely some resources we can look at. ASHE 15 covers, safe design, construction, installation, operation, refrigeration rooms. International Mechanical Code, Chapter 11 does cover refrigeration requirements and emergency monitoring, things like that in the 2021 edition. And then also the International Fire Code has some detailed information in section 608, again, in the 2021 edition, that'll help you kind of inform what could be required in those spaces. Again, my ASHE is another good spot for this. If there are people that have policies, what I would again say is that, while we are seeing some common refrigerants being used, volume of spaces are different. Maybe the quantity of the refrigerant equipment's different. So you really need to kind of tailor a discussion around your location and probably have that with one of your local consultants and try to get nailed down what needs to happen.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. All right. Any other thoughts on this from anyone else? Not hearing any. We'll move on to our next slide, which is in regards to fire drill critiques. We are currently working on standardizing our fire drill forms and processes and found that each hospital in our system does it differently. The Joint Commission and National Fire Protection Association do not specify who should completing the critiques or what the critiques should consist of. Who completes fire drill critiques at your sites? Is it the engineering team, the departments that participated in the drill, or another group? Tim, you want to talk to us about fire drill critiques?
Sure, I'll take that on. To answer the first part of the question, they're correct that there is not a stated job title criteria such that's required for the person who is completing the critiques. The person who does it needs to be knowledgeable of the fire response plan. So we're saying not just knowledgeable of general principles, but what is the fire response plan for the organization? What doors should be shutting when and such like. So they need to understand that. I see facilities that have security personnel that help. I see facilities personnel. I see facilities that will put together a fire drill team, if you will, and that is multidisciplinary, and a team of 2 or 3 or 4 people will go conduct the drill. And in addition to critiquing in the area of activation, also looking at floor above and floor below while they're doing that. So they need to know what the fire response plan is. What to include in the critiques. We need to know what the staff response is. Did the staff do the right thing as per the fire response plan? And that may differ a little bit from facility to facility. Things like closing doors, clearing corridor, knowledge of where to move folks to, where are their smoke barriers, having the staff respond consistent with the fire response plan. They'll need to note the function of the notification systems. Were audible devices able to be heard? Were visual devices able to be seen? Did door releases or other fire smoke partition features function correctly? Were the exits accessible? And are there any conditions that would impede response to fire or smoke? So those are the kind of things that would go in a critique. Where I see a downfall frequently, I see a lot of critiques that the critique form looks great. They're looking at all these things, and they either have problems or they have bad response by staff. And as I go through the fire drills, the critiques every time are the same. Staff didn't respond, nobody closed doors, whatever it may have been. And they just keep doing drills, keep filling out critiques, and nothing changes. The critiques should then drive our actions in performance improvement to bring about change so that we do respond better to those. So hopefully that's helpful a little bit. The idea really is of the critique is to gather information to be able to assess, does everybody know what to do? Is everything working? And if not, what are our gaps? And then we can go back and try to figure out how to mitigate those.
Thanks, Tim. I totally agree with that follow-up issue. The other thing is that the people who are doing the critique need to be aware of the specific area they're at too. Because sometimes the fire response plan is different based on department to department and that kind of stuff. So so they need to, like you mentioned at the very beginning, they need to be knowledgeable of the fire response plan for the area they're critiquing. Any other thoughts from anyone else on this?
Yeah, I think that's spot on what you and Tim said. Yeah, I see that a lot, not just with fire drill forms, but ITM paperwork, et cetera, where nobody's following up. We're doing whatever the activity is, it's being documented. There are problems or shortcomings being noted. Nobody's following up to make sure that it's done correctly. The other thing I would note that I seem fairly effective. Yes.
I'm sorry. I got it. My mic was not working properly. Apologize.
Okay. The other thing that I seem fairly effective is to have a designated person maybe critique the drill if that's the identified zone of origin. But for all the other areas of the hospital, use the department heads of that area to potentially critique the staff response. Because to have one person go around every place in the hospital and ask what happened and how did things go would be very challenging. But you can use the department head, let's say the charge nurse of that unit, to do the critique of how staff responded to that particular fire drill, and maybe ask one more question: how would our response be different if we were the zone of origin? Just to get them thinking along that lines. I think that will go a long way also when a surveyor comes in and asks somebody, when was the last time you participated in a fire drill? Oh yeah, it was a couple months ago when somebody, we had this critique. Didn't even realize it was a fire drill, but we had this critique and they asked us some questions. So I think Tim's answer is very good.
Yeah, that's great, Bill.
Yeah, great ad. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts? All right, we'll move on to our next question. This one's in regards to waste anesthesia gas. Looking for guidance on the frequency to perform WAG vapor testing. Excuse me. Is there a frequency set in stone, or is it based on recommendations by these organizations? Mark, can you talk to this one for us?
Yeah, actually, this should be a pretty quick one. So looking through OSHA, they do recommend air sampling for anesthetic gases every 6 months, basically to cover worker exposure and then make sure that whatever control measures you have in place are actually working. So that's what OSHA recommends. Obviously, as a health system, you could do something different, set that in policy beyond that if you wanted to, but there's at least recommendation from OSHA on what to do there.
Great, thanks, Mark. Any other thoughts? Yeah, this is one of those OSHA standards that a lot of people aren't aware of, or requirements that people aren't aware of. So I know it's one that I have run into issues with previously when I was managing facilities. And that standard's been around for a long, long time. So, all right, we'll go to our next question then. Fire pump and the generator branch. NFPA 20 requires a generator set serving as the alternate power source for our fire pump to meet the requirements for a type 10 system as defined in NFPA 110. However, NFPA 99 does not allow the fire pump to be on the life safety branch. Is this a conflict? Bill, will you talk to this one for us?
Sure. I don't see it as a conflict. A lot of times we think of that 10-second transfer as being the things on the life safety branch. And remember, NFPA 99 is very explicit. This is what's permitted on the life safety branch. Nothing else should be connected to the life safety branch. So the generators is probably, the fire pump probably is going to be connected to my equipment branch. And while we often think about delayed connections and 60-second transfer instead of 10 seconds for a lot of this equipment, there's nothing for the equipment branch that would say you can't do that in 10 seconds. In fact, there's language in the equipment branch section, and you see that on the slide from the 2012 edition of NFPA 99, that says power shall be restored at an appropriate time lag interval. In this case, other codes are telling us that appropriate time lag interval is 10 seconds. We have to have power to that pump within 10 seconds.
Thanks, Bill. Any other thoughts on this one? All right, not hearing any of that on that. We did receive one question in the chat that Wes mentioned earlier that I'd like to see if we can address. That question is, do power strips in non-patient care areas, offices, etc., need to be mounted, or can they be on the floor as long as they are not a trip hazard? Tim, can you talk to that one for us real quick?
We have all the fun questions. This is the point where I'd like to say, Bill, would you like to talk about that? No. Excuse me. The issue of RPTs, power strips, power taps, all the terms that we use largely revolve around where they're at: patient vicinity, patient room, and such like. I am not aware of a specific requirement that outside of patient room, outside of the patient vicinity, those have to be mounted. But we do have to consider safety. And again, I'm kind of a person that's think about safety of people and such first, and then we'll figure out if it's code compliant. Where I see these things get piled up, how much trash and paper and dirt is in them, and what kind of hazard is that if they're down where people are getting their feet into them. Obviously, hazard could be a hazard there. There is a requirement. They are UL listed, and that's one to consider. Some of the really cheapy things you do not want, period, in a facility. So it does have to have a UL listing. The requirement is not for a specific UL listing when it's outside of the patient area, but there is a requirement that it have a UL listing. So I would look at risk assessment. I have seen in the past authorities having jurisdiction cite those ones outside, at a nurse's station or sitting on a counter in a room with IV pumps plugged into it in a clean utility room or something like that. I see those being cited. The other, and then I've also seen surveyors walk by those. The other thing to consider is it possible to start daisy chaining? And that's against the rules too. When they're not mounted, it is so easy for a 6-foot one to become a 12-foot extension cord when another one's plugged in, or we start linking them together, and that is forbidden. So have to look at the use, look at the area very carefully, and what's the potential to happen there.
Great, thanks, Tim. I'd also like to point out that these are considered an electrical device, so they do need to follow your electrical device policy and program. So they should be inspected, and that's, I personally, as a facility manager, I found that the most difficult part of it, because how do you control everybody bringing these things in because they want some extra outlets at their desk? So
think about how you're going to manage it. If people start bringing, if you say, well, they can be loose, then people start bringing their own, and you're out of control. So You've got to really think through how you're going to manage it. And as Jonathan said, manage them as a device.
You bet. So, and we managed those through environmental rounds, and we had a process where we tagged the darn thing and had a sticker that went around the cord. And so we could tell which ones were not inspected when they came in. So, but yeah, it becomes a very difficult thing. Unfortunately, we have just hit the top of the hour. We did get through all of our questions, thank goodness. But we are at the top of the hour. I would like to remind everybody, we do have 2 more Just Ask ASHE events this year. Our third quarter will be at our annual conference. We always do a session there where we allow for questions to be asked. That one is scheduled for Wednesday morning. And then we will have our fourth quarter webinar, just like this one, on November 8th at 12 noon Central Time. And you can already start to register for that one. And you can take and submit questions for that one already. So as those questions come up, please submit those questions, and we appreciate that. Here's contact information for our SMEs today. And I'd like to thank Tim and Mark and Bill for their great insights, and thank everyone for all you do, and especially thank you for all you do to help optimize the healthcare physical environment and keep our patients, staff, and visitors safe. Wes, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks to all of our panelists today for your participation and insight. Everyone, please remember to go back to the Learning Center to complete your evaluation and get your CEC credit for this session. If you've never logged into the Learning Center before, please go to this URL in the chat for instructions on how to do that. And if you have any questions, please contact the ASHE team at asheeducation@aha.org. Thank you all, and have a great day.